Biggest swing games, first couple of weeks in September, because there are a lot of them, as it turns out. And I want to start in week 1, and I want to start in Fayetteville, Arkansas, because that is where Cincinnati, playoff-bound Cincinnati from a year ago, rolls in to face Arkansas. It's one of the toughest out-of-conference schedules in the country Arkansas plays this year. This one's a big swing game for both teams. For Cincinnati, it's very obvious. You know, any of the G5 teams, they normally need to go undefeated to be in the conversation. So if Cincinnati loses this, and they're about a 7 or a 7.5 point dog, according to odds makers right now, then, yeah, that would be the swing for them. Winning and losing, it's a big swing for Cincinnati. But I'm really more focused on Arkansas here, because you see, here's the thing about the perception around Arkansas. No one takes this game for granted. No one looks at this one and says, oh, that's a cakewalk. There's another cream puff for the SEC in week 1. No, it's nothing like that. But no one's looking at it picking Cincinnati to win either. So there's this fine line you walk. You view it as a nice, stiff challenge. It's a resume builder, but it's not a landmine. No one's looking at it like that. But the obvious connotation here in labeling it a swing game is we do have to entertain the idea that Arkansas could lose. I know that's a foreign concept on this show, but Arkansas could lose the game. If they were to lose that game, after all of this immense hype in what a casual would deem the offseason, what if Arkansas is welcoming South Carolina into town week 2 and they're 0-1? That's not something anyone in Preview Magazine land's ready for. So this is a big swing game, because Arkansas's got a bunch of big games down the road. Can't have them start 0-1, can we? ... Second up, which is a game that actually will take place 2 days before this one. This one's off the radar, but it will be on the radar pretty soon once you guys realize this is the first big game you're going to see, unless you count the week 0 game in Ireland. Penn State goes to Purdue in week 1. It's a Thursday night game. And interestingly enough, the way that Fox was able to acquire this thing included Joe Buck going to ESPN. It's one of those little footnotes of history that a game was traded for an announcer. It wasn't exactly a one-for-one swap, but you get the picture there. So the line on this thing is 3.5. Penn State minus 3.5. Make no mistake, this is not just a swing game for Penn State. It's both of them. I know on the national radar you hear Purdue and you think afterthought in the Big Ten. Well, they're not for 2 reasons. Number 1, they got a quarterback that's about 37 years old. He's been there a long time. But number 2, they play in the Big Ten West, and this very well could be the toughest game they play all year. I would argue their game at Wisconsin is tougher, but it's comparable at the very least. If they get by Penn State in week 1, here's what's going to happen. You know it happens every year. You have that prime standalone game on the Thursday night. Think about, for instance, when Texas A&M went into South Carolina and they just drugged South Carolina several years ago, Kevin Sumlin era, and Kenny Hill got labeled a Heisman favorite for about a week. When you have that Thursday night game, especially the winner of that game, you get an inordinate amount of praise because no one has calibrated how to handle things because it's week 1, it's the first thing you're seeing, and everyone's bet on the game. Probably an irresponsible amount of money you'll be betting on Purdue or Penn State. If Purdue wins that game, especially if quarterback Aiden O'Connell shines, you will look at them and everyone all of a sudden will be an expert on Purdue. But the point is, even if they're a little overhyped, look at the schedule. Indiana State the next week, at Syracuse, Florida Atlantic. They got back-to-back road games. Yes, they do. Against Minnesota, which is in turmoil at the moment, and Maryland, Nebraska. They get down to October 22nd before there's another game that makes you really go, ooh, man. And that's at Wisconsin. They finish up with Iowa, at Illinois, Northwestern, at Indiana. You keep waiting for that Ohio State bombshell. There's not one. You keep waiting for Michigan. There's not one. So Purdue, if they get past that first game against Penn State, this is not a meat grinder of a schedule. But on the other side with Penn State, feels the same as it did last year. They knew that they were opening against Wisconsin last year. They had Auburn in week 3. Those were going to be coin flip games, and it was going to determine the trajectory of the season. As it turns out, they won both of them and still underachieved because of injury at the quarterback position. But it's the same way this year. We don't predict injury. They got a very, very tight game there against Purdue. 2 weeks later, they go to Auburn. And so what are they going to be when they play Michigan on October 15th? 1-loss team, 2-loss team, undefeated team. Think about how different that game looks. You got undefeated Penn State going into Michigan all of a sudden, October 15th. That's not a game the nation is talking about yet. That's how college football unfolds. You got to use the context that week by week you get on Saturdays. So that's a big one. What a veteran quarterback battle. Think Sean Clifford and Aiden O'Connell, combined age, triple digits or very close to it. So it's going to be fun to watch. FSU versus LSU is the Sunday night standalone game. The Labor Day weekend, it's week 1, so this is the Sunday night game. This is the game that will make us start our show early on Sunday night. Each of these teams, if you think about it, each of them has that kind of 5% scenario where everything goes right and they win 9 games. That is in the cards. It's not likely, but there's a path where if everything went right for FSU or LSU, and they just hit home runs all year, they'd go 9-3. That could happen. Point being, that's out the window automatically for whichever one of them loses this game. And it may not be likely for the winner, but it's certainly out of the cards for the loser. It's a bigger swing game for LSU, though, because to me, I think about Florida State now. This is the way I feel about Florida State. I look at them, especially if they're competitive in this game, they can dust themselves off. I mean, they came very close against LSU in the Superdome. You know, nothing to write home about, but that's also no great shame. They go back home, they dust themselves off, they get ready for conference play, and they still have a very good season. If LSU loses this game, though, number one, that's just how you forever remember the Brian Kelly era starting. It's a big recruiting game for him, too. But the third thing to remember is LSU's schedule is so backloaded. LSU's schedule, it screams, you better start fast, you better start 4-0, 5-0, because eventually you get to that kind of cliff, and then all of a sudden it gets really, really fast downhill really quick on the back half of it. And I'm looking at it right now. Just to give you an idea, if you're listening on podcast, they got Florida State. Okay, then they got Southern. Really fun game for the locals down there. That halftime show was Southern in town. I heard Jordy Collada the other day had the AD on down there. What a good get that was, and they were talking about that. So Southern, Mississippi State, New Mexico, I know you guys are looking at that stretch and you're saying we should be 4-0. When we go to Auburn, we should be 4-0. Odds makers would agree with you. I'm not arguing that either. But if there's a blemish already, and you've still got Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, Ole Miss, Bama, Arkansas, UAB, A&M, just back to back to back. It's body blow after body blow after body blow. That's when you start looking at a situation where you go from hoping to win 8 or 9 to, oh, let's just make a bowl game. Please let us make a bowl game. So it's a big swing game there. That's week 1. Let's go to week 2. This one's going to be really fun. It's going to be played in an NFL stadium because that's where Pitt plays their games. But Tennessee at Pitt in week 2. This one was fun last year. Pitt edged them down at Neyland last year. So Tennessee goes up there in week 2. This is where you're going to find out one of two things. Okay, very clear. You're either going to find out that Pitt made the right moves and they saw Kenny Pickett go to the NFL draft, but they got Keaton Slovis, presumably. He ends up starting at quarterback. They brought in some receiver help, and it was enough to where their offense was potent enough to where they absorbed the challenge from Tennessee, and they responded, and they beat them again, which also probably indicates Pitt is going to be a big player in the ACC race, even though it's not a conference game. Either that happens, or Tennessee goes up there and wins. And however Tennessee wins, I personally wouldn't care. Get the win on the road by any means necessary, but that puts Tennessee on track to be undefeated when Florida comes to town in week 4. As you know, there are a few games I get selfish on, and one of them is I would kind of prefer to see Florida versus Tennessee, undefeated versus undefeated week 4. Part of that equation relies on Tennessee going and beating Pitt. I don't like to play favorites, but I kind of am. Speaking of that hypothetical week 4 matchup, another thing that we need to happen involves the following game, Kentucky at Florida. I didn't put Utah at Florida on here week 1 because I was going to talk about this one. So I could go either way. Kentucky at Florida is in week 2. This one very much qualifies as a swing game. So this outcome plays very much into that week 4 game. If you're going to have undefeated versus undefeated there, you need Florida to not only take care of Utah, but to take care of Kentucky. How about Kentucky, though? You know, Kentucky's looked at as a lot of people's sleeper pick. They do it every year with good reason. It's a very solid program. But Kentucky's schedule, if they win this game, all of a sudden gets really interesting because I don't think people have it memorized. And I don't think people have particularly paid a lot of attention to it. But all of a sudden, if Kentucky gets this win, which I don't think people are chalking up in the preseason, then you'll start looking, and there are a lot of these kinds of games. There are a lot of those kinds of games on Kentucky's schedule. But there's not another, until they play Georgia. And you know what I mean by that if you're into perusing SEC schedules. Whenever you see someone playing Bama or Georgia, that's the oh. Or maybe if you got to go to A&M, that's a oh. But Kentucky, after they play Florida, they got a couple of out-of-conference games they should win. They go to Ole Miss. That's a They got South Carolina at home. That's a Mississippi State. At Tennessee. At Missouri. It's not until they get all the way down to the Georgia game, which is the second to last week of the year, where you go, whew. But if they've already beaten Florida, who's to say they hadn't beaten everyone else there? Or who's to say they may not be more than a one-loss team? Who knows what that Georgia game could mean? And let's just not assume that the Georgia Bulldogs are unscathed there in the second to last week of the year. Crazier things have happened. So that swing game in week 2, I know there's a wide gap between September 10th and November 19th. But when you look at what's between one and the other, hey, Kentucky, especially if Will Levis is fulfilling on that immense potential of his at quarterback, could be a really interesting team because coming out of that game, everyone's spotlight will be on them, whereas it won't be, I don't think, going into that game.